You are in the world, and we are recording. Welcome to the Earth Exchange Cafe. Once a month, we meet with all sorts of wonderful people who are doing the work out there in their own world. But in this world, we're inviting you to open the doors of your favorite cafe. And there's streams of music and light shining on beautiful artwork that's on the walls and tapestries and the books all around of the people who've written amazing, inspiring books and articles ready to be read, and magazines littering the tables all around you. So I invite you all to come and sit in your favorite chair once again. And there, magically, your absolute favorite drink appears to quaff for the next hour as we chat. And as we settle on in, maybe there's a fire roaring because it's midwinter and we all need a little bit of warmth. And we just settle on in and just letting ourselves breathe in and just breathe out, letting go of all the stresses and strains of this challenging world, knowing that for the next hour or so, we're going to be wrapped in the most wonderful of conversations about what it really is like to find and make beauty in such a wounded world. And today our conversation is with Day. And I'm going to hand over to Trevi to introduce you.
Thank you, Harry. That was lovely. Yes, we are very pleased today and excited to talk with Day Schildkret, whom many of you probably already know or know of. He is an internationally renowned author, artist, and teacher. And he is the creator of the Morning Altars movement, which has inspired thousands of people to make life more beautiful and more meaningful with ritual, nature, and art. He has nearly 100,000 followers on social media, and he does workshops, installations, trainings, and speaking events all over the world. He is a thought leader devoted to healing the culture by teaching people to ritualize the big and small moments of our work and of our lives. And he's going to be talking about that with us today. Day is the author of Hello, Goodbye, 75 Rituals for Times of Loss, Celebration, and Change, and a previous book, Morning Altars, a 7-step practice to nourish your spirit through nature, art, and ritual. He has taught workshops and created installations at Google, the 9/11 Memorial Plaza, the Hammerstein Ballroom, the Andy Warhol Foundation, California Academy of Sciences, Esalen, and many more. Day, welcome to Earth Exchange Cafe.
So happy to be here. I have my mug of coffee.
Good. You came prepared.
I had a fire.
Your quaff. So I know you speak about this in your book, your first book, but it would be really interesting to hear how you begin your morning altars. I mean,
the origin.
Could you walk us through the process and like your own inner process, not as if you were teaching it, but like how do you set out? How do you find the place where you're going to go? How do you know what to collect? Just walk us through your whole personal process, if you would.
Well, I hear two questions, so I'm going to try and answer both of them at the same time. Let's see if I can do this. I heard the hint of an origin question from you. So I want to just speak to that for a second, and then
we'll get to the origin later. I want to know your daily process first, if you would.
Sure. Okay. Well, they're connected. So my origin story and my daily process are both connected to me learning how to be in relationship with my life and with what's happening in my life. And so to me, my origin story, and I'll speak to it in more detail later if you ask the question, is about loss and grief, and how to be in relationship with that. Because the origin was the loss of my father and the loss of a relationship. And yet my process every day is learning how to be in relationship. You asked a lot of how questions. How do I find my space? How do I find my material? How do I find But to me, it's not so much a question of how, it's a question of who. My relationship with the place that I live is a conversation like the one we're having right now. And it's a back and forth. And so, for instance, when I leave my front door and I go outside of my house, I'm in a much bigger world. And it's a conversation. Where do I go? How do I know what I'm going to find? There's a lot of wandering inside of that. And there's a lot of wondering. And in many ways, I have to step outside of myself. I have to get out of my own way and start sensitizing myself to the world. Does this make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so the sensitizing is really just asking, who am I exploring? Where am I? What is this? And as soon as I start getting really curious about the place that I live and about where I am and what's around me, the place herself starts to show me what's there. And I start to find material that is gorgeous and interesting and colorful, and I'm surprised, and I step out of my own thoughts and my own ruminations, and I am led back into this wonderful world that is alive and changing. And I'm met with treasure, really. I don't know how else to say it. And so the whole thing is an exploration of relationships.
So do you have certain guidelines for yourself? I mean, certain things that you would follow, like, for example, not using certain things in your works, not driving, or only going to the places where you would start your focal points on foot. And, you know, are there certain prescribed ways that you have of doing it for yourself?
Before I speak to that, I'm curious why. Why the question about prescribed? Why are you curious about it?
I'm curious about it because often we have guidelines for ourselves the way we do things. And I'm wondering what yours might be.
So there's always rules that help me regulate my relationship with exploitation. So I'm operating rules where I don't want to engage with the living world from a place of taking, even though that happens all of the time. My relationship is in some ways about slowing down and asking permission. So my rules are rules of courtesy. And how can I reanimate the relationship and not see it as like a grocery store where I'm there to just take what I find is pretty? Because in that way I am overtaking. And I'm I'm not an expert in this. I am a human and I practice this. And so I'm constantly finding that edge of like me wanting more and having these guidelines that say like, actually, you have enough. And so they help me get in touch with that sense of enoughness. And also creativity loves limitations. So oftentimes I make the most beautiful art when I have the least amount to work with.
Mm.
And so that is an important part of my practice, is actually pushing the boundaries of what I think is enough. And so my rules, I have actually 3 rules of foraging that I teach my students. The first rule is ask permission, which I've already mentioned, and that actually reanimates the relationship, because you wouldn't necessarily ask permission from an object, you ask permission from a subject. The second rule is give before you take. So in some ways, it's asking my students and my readers to be in a process of reciprocity, not just to take, but actually like, what does it mean to give back? And what would you give back to a plant or a tree or a flower? These are wonderful questions. The most interesting answers to these questions often I get from children. Oftentimes, like, it's the kids that say, I would give it a song, or I'd give it a
Mm.
kiss, or I'd, offer it water. The children are the ones that are really, they really understand this process. And as we become adults and we, in some ways, grow very distant from that childlike sense of wonder, we get solidified in our stance. And so in some ways, this is a process of like softening ourselves and reconnecting with that child that lives inside of us. So give before you take. And then the third rule that I always obey in my process is take a little, leave a lot. And that also speaks to this process of overtaking. And underlying it is this feeling of not enough, which many of us struggle with. Both physically, we struggle with, like, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough things, I don't have enough. Today's Valentine's Day, I don't have enough love. But underneath it all is a deep feeling of I am not enough. And so in some ways, the practice of leave a little, take a little, leave a lot is helping us reconnect with the enormous abundance, the unfathomable abundance of our living world.
So in a specific question about the way you do your altars, morning altars, and I'm going to actually, maybe I'll ask you that question in a minute. I'm going to try and share a screen from a page of your website.
Okay.
There we go. Can you see this?
Yep.
Can everybody see this? Okay. So I'm just going to scroll through so people can see some of these exquisite
These
pieces.
are large scale installations that I've done. That is at a cemetery right there. Oh, if you go up, this piece is at a cemetery in Minnesota that I build in every summer. For the last 7 years, I've made a 20-ish to 25-foot installation made of the material from the cemetery. If you look at the edge of that piece, it's made of stones. Every stone there has had hands touched to it and a name imbibed into it. There's someone actually remembering a loved one that had died, and they're putting it on the altar. So the entire thing is framed by memory. The year before, I built a similar, very different altar, but as big of an installation. And that year we did memory seeds, so people could plant seeds into the soil of the altar and remember their dead. And then they got a chance to collect the soil at the end of the installation and plant that soil and those seeds into their own personal gardens so that those memories would grow again.
Beautiful. And just stop me if you want to speak on any one of these.
Sure. These are large scale installations
Yeah.
that I've done. So yeah, these are all carrying different, they're all places of gatherings. So either for meditation, for contemplation, for prayer, for remembrance, etc. This piece right here is I made in Utah. Everything in that piece right there was found under one tree.
Wow.
All of the berries, all of the bones, all of the leaves, even the apples was found under one tree.
Huh.
And so that was an altar, really. And if you look at the berries, you see that there's different colors. They're all different. They're all the same berry, at different ages of their life and different relationships with the sun. And so that piece was basically an offering to the land and that tree, and a remembrance of the different cycles of life.
Well, actually, I had wanted to show the morning altars in this way, but I lost the page right before we came on. So,
If you go to art up at the top,
yep.
and you click on altars.
All right, let's just have a look at, there we
And
go.
these are smaller altars that I've made.
Yeah.
Mhm. And each one of them is dedicated to something different. Each one of them comes with a story. If you click on one, there's the story attached to it.
Uh-huh.
And then also a prayer. So this one says, discovered a hidden patch of false bird of paradise hanging like tropical bejeweled necklace, was visited 3 times by a giant green iguana while creating. Tropical downpour every hour. The rain left everything sparkling. And then the prayer was, may your style be a beautiful way for you to see and be seen. So every one of these comes with what happened that day, and kind of a reporting of what it was like to make it. Because my art, as I think what we're talking about here, is born from the time and place. It's a product of the weather and the season and what was growing at the time and what was dying at the time. And so the prayer that comes from that is born of time and place.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, all of my art, every single piece that you just shown, every single one, doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So
Well, yeah, no, and I think that's why that's something that your works have in common with Radical Joy for Hard Times, because our groups go out and people go to places that are hurt, either from human or natural acts or whatever combination there is of that. And they share the stories of what the place means to them. They get to know it as it is now, and then they make a simple gift of beauty for the place. And what's so relevant is that you don't make this gift in order to be famous, in order to have people come and look at it, that the wind, the animals, the rain, the sun, traffic on the highway, it takes it, it becomes the next artist.
So I teach a training, a certification training. We're now in our 3rd cohort. We have about 200 students from about 15 different countries. And coming up in the next couple of weeks, we're about to do our 4th weekend together on the 5th step of the practice, which is gifting, which is kind of what you just spoke to. This practice isn't just art. We're not just making something pretty. We're actually making something that has a purpose. It's a gift. I don't know if you're familiar, well, maybe you are, but maybe I don't know if your viewers are familiar with the book The Gift by Lewis Hyde. It's a pretty important book. But there's different principles of what a gift is. And one of the most important principles is that a gift has to move. As soon as you stop a gift from moving, it no longer carries the properties of being a gift. So in the same way, we're offering beauty as a gift to a place, sometimes to a place that's been injured or hurt, or to a people that have been injured or hurt. And the question is, how can that gift move? And the very soul of my work is impermanence, meaning that the gift is literally moving. It's moving by the wind or by the rain or by animals or by people. And it's moving out into the world. And I want my students and readers to understand that that's an important part of the process. It's not about trying to keep it as it is. It's seeing the beauty and the prayer and the intention as a gift that moves into the world. And so the impermanence is the gift.
Yeah.
I wonder, I've got a sort of a query then. I'm very interested in how beautiful your creations are and the asking permission. So I'm going to maybe ask a sort of behind the scenes question, but what happens when you go to a place and something doesn't want to be part of the creation? What's the relationship there with the sense of relinquishment of the woundedness or part of the story is what's not in the picture? How does that work?
So you're talking about foraging specifically?
Yeah. So yeah, from that point of view.
In our training, we do a process that we call red light, yellow light, green light. And so I teach my teachers how to be sensitized to a yes, a no, and an I don't know, or a maybe. And so that is a conversation between them and the living world. And like anything with consent, yeses are pretty clear. They sound like a yes, like with a human being, and nos are pretty clear, right? With a human being. And maybes, or I don't knows, or I can't hear it, or I'm unsure, or all of that. What I teach is it means further engagement. It means further conversation. What does it mean to continue to ask, or continue to soften yourself, or continue to, and eventually, if you're still unclear, it's a no. And so a lot of the times when I'm working with new students, for instance, I'm in the middle of an intensive right now, 4 weeks. It's not very long to work with students. Most of the time I'm asking them to just forage what's fallen, because they don't entirely know yet what it means to be in that dance. I mean, that's a practice. That takes a lot of skill to be able to like ask and feel, and it's any relationships take time to understand the sensitivities and subtleties and nuances of relationships. So taking what's fallen. However, even taking what's fallen, I mean, you're moving pieces. That could be, for instance, like a bunch of branches on the floor, on the ground, could be someone's home.
Mm.
So I'm still asking them to engage with that yellow light, red light, green light practice. And at the same time, taking what's fallen to the ground, I think is much easier for people that are new into this practice to digest and practice.
Mm.
And I like that. It's because the maybe or the not knowing, that can be the most interesting one.
Always.
Because then it invites you to say, oh yeah, like you say, what else is there? What needs to happen? Maybe if I ask again in 5 minutes after I've given a tree some water or had a little walk around the place without touching anything, then something is different, but it's a wonderful opportunity to engage more deeply.
I mean, the engagement I'm banging a drum about in my work is curiosity and wonder. It is the heart of the practice. And so certainty is not really, getting a yes or a no, that's fine. But really learning how to ask good questions and stay in a space of curiosity when you don't know, to me is how relationships deepen. And it's a skill. And so when we get to practice that skill of curiosity and not knowing and proceeding with not knowing, that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's something in there very much about imposing what we think is what we want, and actually being in that reciprocity and that courtesy that you were mentioning about actually, especially maybe new students who want to achieve and look like they're being creative, which may override actually what's being investigated and inquired about, which is, what is this site wanting you to create that tells the story of that site and the relationality of that?
So
and
much
how
of
do
the
we step
time,
outside of ourselves in order for that to happen? It's a
exactly.
fascinating question.
The weekend we just did in the training was a weekend devoted to the third and fourth step of the practice, which is clear and create. And it's a very creative weekend. And a lot of the work that I'm teaching my students is to see themselves as a vessel. And so the clearing part of the weekend is really trying to understand what gets in the way. Where's how do we get in the way of ourselves, or what clutters that vessel? And then once we practice clearing and opening ourselves, in many ways I really don't want to use this word, but it's probably the best word to use right now, is we become channels. And we become channels to inspiration. We become channels to vision. We become channels to creativity. It moves through us. It doesn't come from us. It moves through us. And that's why this practice is so unique, is because in many ways, the inspiration is coming from the place herself.
Mm-hmm.
And we are just allowing ourselves to really receive her, and for it to come back into the world in our own unique expression. So it's a marriage of our creativity and the place's creativity. And that's where the beauty is sourced.
Exactly. So I'm curious what you were like as a child. What were you doing were you doing art? Were you hanging out in nature? How did you relate to the aliveness of the places where you lived?
One of my earliest memories as a kid is saving worms. So it's raining here right now, and this would be the exact weather that I would love as a kid, which was I would run out on the driveway and I'd pluck a little leaf from my nearby tree. We had a beautiful birch tree growing up, and I would spend like 2 or 3 hours saving worms on the driveway. And I'd help them get onto each leaf. I was, this kind of kid. And I would bring each worm, I'd puncture a hole on the front lawn of my home, and I'd help each worm find their way back home. And the origin story is that my parents would tell me that I would decorate the wormholes. And so I'd have a constellation of like wormhole mandalas. And my parents thought it was very cute.
Wow.
And then growing up, I actually found a love for the theater. And so then my love of nature kind of was at a crossroads, and I actually found myself working. I eventually worked on Broadway for about 8 years, until I realized that I was inside all of the time, and I couldn't be inside. Some days I wouldn't even see the sun. And so I started to marry that with doing these summertime art residencies in forests in different parts of the country. And I would do art residencies and spend the entire summer outside and the entire rest of the year indoors in the theater. But the theater to me was a space where I could tell stories and I can do ritual. To me, theater is ritual. And so I was trying to understand my love of storytelling and my love of theater in the year. And in the summer, I was trying to understand my love of nature. And then somehow or other, what I do right now is a calling. And I don't know where it came from. Some part of me thinks it's a very, very old ancestor in my lineage who planted a seed, 5,000 years ago, and it just sprouted in my lifetime. Because this is not something that any of my recent family would have taught me. But this practice marries the things I love and the things I think are needed in the world, which are ritual, which are nature connection, which are creative expression and storytelling.
Yeah, and if your parents remember you making mandalas around the wormholes, I mean, it just sounds like this has just always been part of you.
It has.
So moving up, closer to today in your origin story, you said that it was a painful time in your life, the death of your father and a breakup, that were the inspirations, maybe directly or indirectly, for making the morning altars. Could you tell us that story?
Sure. Yeah, it was 2011. My father had died. Well, he was dying for about 3 or 4 years before that. And also the culmination of that was leading to tension in my relationship at the time. And they both kind of fell apart at the same time. My father died and my relationship ended. And I also, part of the story is I adopted my father's dog, Rudy, little miniature schnauzer, and she saved my life because she got me out of the house. I think if without the dog, I probably would have hermited in the house, because I don't know if either of you have experienced that kind of grief, but it is disorienting and it undoes you. And I had trouble working and socializing and all of the things. And so we would go on these long dog walks through the hills of where I was living. She would be quite curious, as dogs do, and I would be ruminating in my mind because there was so much loss and I was trying to understand how to walk again. And so one morning we came to the top of this hill and this eucalyptus tree, early morning, dawn, and underneath the tree were these beautiful amber colored mushrooms that looked like they were painted with watercolor. And maybe that 5-year-old boy was the one that like held my hand and had me sit under that tree. But I did. And I started to arrange the mushrooms. And I started to arrange the eucalyptus bark and the eucalyptus caps, and I just took whatever was around me under that tree. I didn't even get up to forage that in that time. And I spent an hour that felt like a minute, and I made something quite beautiful. And I didn't even know what I was doing, but in some ways I knew in that moment that my grief had lightened, that I was feeling in some ways tethered back to life. And so something, I don't know if this is the right word, but something medicinal happened to me then, therapeutic. And I had the wherewithal to challenge myself. Could I come back to that tree for 30 days and make one every day? And so that's what I did for 30 days is I would grab a basket, I'd take the dog on a walk, I would suddenly start looking for things on the ground, of crow feather, elderberries, a beautiful leaf. In some ways, the foraging process was therapeutic enough because it was getting me out of my head and into the world. And seeing beauty reminds you that there is such a thing in the world. And so I would go up to that tree, I would make a piece, I'd spend an hour, become my favorite part of the day. I'd feel enlivened. I would dedicate it some days to my dad, some days to my ex. 30 days came and went, I didn't want to stop. And so I continued to do it. There's this one story where I took a week off to go on a vacation. And when I came back, and I started to do my practice again, I went to that same tree, and under that tree in eucalyptus buttons was a question mark that someone had made.
Wow.
And so I knew that my own practice was not just engaging the place, but it was engaging the people too in that place. And so then I started to put out what I was making to friends and family. And then I started to put it out. This was at the time when social media was just starting to come up. And I started to put it out into the world, and people all over the world were somehow inspired to go out into their backyards or their parks and collect material from what they made and to create their own and send me a photo of what they made with their story. For instance, this one, I'm having a memory, this one woman, an English woman, said, she wrote me an email, said she was dropped her kid off at school, sitting in the school's parking lot. It was her mother's 10th death anniversary. She didn't know what to do because her culture didn't give her any rituals to mark that moment. And so she was scrolling on Instagram, partially probably to cope with her grief. And she came to my account, and it inspired her to get out of the car and to go into the woods behind her school. And she collected moss and pine cones, and she said she found fox bones. And she sat on the ground and made an altar with the material she found. She said it was the first time in 10 years she felt like she was talking to her mom.
Wow.
She felt connected to her mom again. And so I receive stories like this, multiple times a week from people all over the world who are transmuting their pain into beauty, or their stories into beauty, or their milestones into beauty. And so this has become, as you started off the conversation, a movement. And the most important thing for me, and this is why I do all of my trainings, is it has to be community led. So I do me, and I've been at the forefront of creating this practice, but now people are, I have therapists and social workers and clergy and kindergarten teachers who are bringing this into their communities and giving it to their peoples. And so to me, that's the gift. I received this gift to transmute my pain, but now I'm giving it away, and other people are giving it to other people. And I think that's why we're all gathered in this conversation, is we're all kind of committed to helping people connect with the places that they live and to make beauty out of their pain. And so that's my commitment, and I'm answering that call. And to be completely honest, it's been, making impermanent nature art. Everyone laughed as a career when I first said yes to this calling, because we don't live in a culture that values anything that we're doing here. Right? But to me, I'm trying to lean into how else it could be. And so just to finish what I was saying. So
I thought you were finished.
I've committed myself to this calling. and I'm giving my life force to it, and I'm seeing it sprout all over the world. And so anyway, I'm honored to be here in amongst friends where this is valued.
Well, a couple of things. One is when you were telling your story just now, and I didn't realize that when you started out for that first month, you had gone back and back and back to the same tree, which is
For a
extraordinary
year.
because it just shows that you don't have to dip into on one place once and then you go out and you look for something different or something better or something more colorful or whatever. You can go back to the same place repeatedly, and the beauty is still waiting there to be brought to life in a new form.
I was monogamous with that tree for quite a while.
Yeah,
We deepened in our relationship. One of the gifts that has come from COVID and all of us being online is that when I do trainings now, part of it is financial. People don't have to travel, they can kind of zoom in like we're doing. But part of it, the real gift, is that the students that I teach get to actually connect with the places that they live. So I'm not bringing people to a one-time retreat center where like they don't have a relationship with the plants or the place. They get to go out in their backyard and cultivate that continued relationship, which I think is kind of crucial for
absolutely.
understanding relationships.
So I wanted to read something and ask you about this. This is something that you wrote, I believe, on your website, but I'm not sure. As an artist, my eye is often drawn toward the fallen, and my hands yearn to resurrect and redeem that which is considered valueless. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, specifically because with Radical Joy for Hard Times, we do go to these hurt places, and people make beauty out of. They might make things out of the ashes of a home that's burned, or people will make beauty out of rubbish, which they then will take out, and carry away from the place. So, and then when I look at your mandalas, and I see these things that may have fallen on the ground, but when they are put together, they're so beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a long journey into that question, but just explain what you meant by that. My hands yearn to resurrect and redeem that
Sure.
which is considered valueless.
Yeah. So, there's a lot. If you've read my writing, not necessarily the website, but my books, I am a word nerd and I love etymology. And I love understanding words as having roots like trees, and they're born someplace. Their roots are connected to a place, and words travel through time and space, and they change as they travel, just like people do. And so when you read that just now, it reminds me of the word art, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European word arti, A-R-T-I, which means to put back together again. And so it's a la Humpty Dumpty, there's broken pieces, it fell, and Humpty Dumpty needs to put back together again. And you can't ignore the cracks with Humpty Dumpty, but there's a wholeness again. And so my art, and this art, is redemptive in the sense that it's literally taking many pieces and putting them into a semblance of temporary order and togetherness. Temporary is the key. And that is what healing is. It's redeeming brokenness into wholeness. And also that is the very root of the word art, which is it's taking many pieces, things that people might not see in their piecemealness, but by bringing it into a sense of order or story or beauty, you can see it in a way you've never seen it before and value it in a way that was probably not valued. I mean, that is good art. I'm not talking about entertainment. I'm talking about art, which must, I think, and I'm joined by lots of thinkers in this. I'm thinking of Martin Prechtel, especially, but good art, real art, necessary art must come from a place of brokenness. Otherwise, it's just, entertainment. And so to me, I'm looking to resurrect and redeem the broken pieces because I think beauty is healing. And it can serve in that way to heal. And so, that is the root of art, and that's the root of my practice.
So do you consider the things that you pick up valueless or broken?
Of course. Yeah, because we step on them, we step over them, we rake them. We're people in our day-to-day. Look, the enemy of the question is speed. We're walking around too quickly. We're driving too fast. We stop seeing, we stop noticing. And in that, it becomes a matter of prioritization. What's valuable? Leaves to most people are not valuable. Flowers are not really valuable. Even trees or landscape, I can go much bigger. It's not that valuable unless it's developed, unless there's something there. Look at the language, the way we talk about like open land, undeveloped, and so there's a cultural deficiency here. We don't value the things that have fallen. We don't, and I'll take it even a step further. We don't value the things that are dying or dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there's a grief illiteracy and a death phobia inherent in the question. And so beauty innately redeems the things we stop seeing. And so, yes, I do think and I have a life experience now to say on their own, leaves are not that valuable. But when I make something beautiful with them, I can tell you thousands of people stop and stare. And then I have their attention and I can teach them about something. So there is a redemptive quality in art.
So moving through that, going back to what you said about community and some of those projects that have been specifically because of a community experience, or that there's a landscape that's at risk, or can you give us maybe a story, perhaps a specific example of how the process of the morning altars has actually given value or support or a therapeutic healing to a community, so that really maybe people who are watching can get an idea of just what it means to be given a value through such an artistic way of doing things.
Sure. Yeah. There's so many stories of communities that I've worked with. I'm part of what we saw when you were showing examples of my art is that, for instance, that cemetery in Minneapolis, I'm there every year making an altar for them. And they're the same people, there's over 1,000 people that come every year to engage with remembering their dead through beauty making. So inherently, they're understanding that that there's a repetitive returning that happens annually, every year. They come back to the same spot and they get to raise up their loved ones. And so that's the very nature of ritual. The word ritual itself, etymologically, the word means to count. But how I interpret that etymology is that counting can be repetitive, in the same way that dancers and musicians count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so that's what that community is doing every year. They're coming back to that same spot and they're remembering together every year, remembering together every year. And that, honestly, up until probably 200 years ago, that's what it was, mostly all over the world. That is what my culture does. Thank God I still, even though we've been displaced, my own family has been displaced so many times. In my culture, I come from a Jewish culture, we are consistently, annually engaged in a lot of repetitive remembering throughout the year. And that rhythm has taught me how important it is for a people to gather back together again. And there you have the same mechanism that is involved in my art and practice, which is we're displaced, we're many, we come back together temporarily to remember or make meaning or whatever, and then we go back displaced again. And we have that rhythm of coming together, falling apart, coming together, falling apart. And that is part of what it means to be in community, is gathering together for a purpose, to remember, to make meaning, to heal, to support each other, whatever it is. And then, but not to hold it and make it permanent. That's like, this motion is kind of like breathing or the ocean. It's right. It's the ebb and the flow of things. And so when you involve art or altar making, for me, it becomes a centerpiece. It becomes like a way of making the meaning real. So much is remembered just through the art of making. And so I like, I come from a culture where ritual was really important, but I don't know about art or creativity. And so I'm doing my best to weave in these other pieces: nature, creativity, ritual, nature, creativity, ritual. And that to me is the three pillars of my practice, and also I think of communities, or should be.
Yeah. It's certainly what we do with Radical Joy for Hard Times. Those three are all very much interwoven.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, before we have to stop in a few minutes, I wanted to ask you about your newest book, which was published last year, Hello, Goodbye. Such a great title. 75 Rituals for Times of Loss, Celebration, and Change. And you've covered so many different kinds of rituals, from dealing with a miscarriage, coming out, moving to a new home, even losing a tooth. So I wondered, I mean, do people come to you to ask you to help them create rituals? And if so, could you tell us about one of those?
I'd say more so my intention is, I treat ritual, and this book in particular, like a cookbook. And so I've raised up, as you mentioned, 36 life transitions. And my plea for my reader is to not let them pass you by. Don't just keep on going on with life. Mark those moments. But unfortunately, many people think that they don't have the time, they don't have the capacity, rituals belong to religion, whatever the excuses are. And so I treat the book and I treat my teachings in this like I'm teaching people how to cook. And sure, in this book in particular, I give a bunch of recipes, and you can make those recipes. But what I'm asking my reader to consistently consider is take it, leave it, change it, make it yours. Most importantly, cook something up. Try making something. It's like giving people a pan and a stick of butter and some eggs. Like, you don't have to be a Michelin chef to make an omelet, or scrambled eggs, is probably easier. You just have to try and make an attempt. And the best attempts are transitional moments. And that could be big life milestone moments, like, a divorce or loss of a pet. Or that could be like smaller transitional moments, like you woke up this morning or you're going to bed tonight. But the most important thing, and my work and my soul lives at the edge in transitions. I'm a transitional teacher. I'm helping people make meaning, make beauty, make understanding, make sense of transitions. And so that book is devoted to helping give people the skills to be able to mark those times.
So have you thought about, or how to help people with climate change, for example, the biggest transition in the lives of all of us?
I'd say, from my experience working with a lot of people, this subject can be really overwhelming. In general, climate change. I'm overwhelmed by it. I don't even know how to approach it. But we have very specific experiences these days where we're all being impacted locally. And so my work isn't necessarily to talk about, I don't wouldn't even know how to approach such a topic. However, most recently I've worked with communities that have their towns have burned down from wildfires. So it's not necessarily quote unquote climate change. Sure it is, but it's more like their homes are gone, their forests are gone, their trees are gone, they've lost, there's loss. What does it mean to gather together again and to mark what has been lost and to try and make sense of this time? And how do we bring ritual and meaning and grief and understanding to something that makes no sense?
So tell us about one of those rituals in the place where there's been a community that's burned.
Okay, let me give you an example of a woman first from that community, and then I'll give you an example of a community itself. So an example that I tell in Hello Goodbye is a woman that her home burned down in a wildfire, and it wasn't her home, just her home, it was her grandfather's home. So the home itself and the woodwork of the home and the structure of the home and everything of the home, which tethered her to her own family, disappeared within a day. The only thing that stood was a gazebo, an iron gazebo that she somehow salvaged from the fire. And so she took that, they had to move, they were displaced for, I think, almost a year. And she was not sleeping, she wasn't doing well, she was completely undone from that experience. They eventually found a new home to live in a year later. And I interviewed her for Hello Goodbye. And she told me that she did a ritual with her husband and her children where they went back to the place of the fire where the home used to stand. And they stood in this wrought iron gazebo. And they did a ritual of remembrance. And they placed stones where, kind of in the outline, the circle of where the gazebo stood. And then they took the gazebo up and they transported it to the new home. And that was the only living structure and memory from the old home. And then they welcomed that new structure and they placed flower petals around the base of the gazebo. And they welcomed in the memories and told stories and tried to plant seeds that would maybe sprout one day so that those memories would be carried over to the new home. Beautiful story, beautiful ritual, helps this family understand and in some ways heal from something so devastating. And I have examples like that with communities doing similar things, gathering around stumps of trees, for instance, that had burned down and trying to remember their love of the place and to make beauty on those stumps. And so communities I've worked with, sometimes, I'll gather 100 people in a burned forest and we will create altars around the bases of what used to be the trees. And it is for the place itself, but it's also for the people to be able to process what happened there, and to leave something more beautiful, both for the place and for themselves. So, ritual is one of the things that can help us make sense of something that's senseless.
Thank you. Yes, and I would like to invite you to participate in our Global Earth Exchange this year on June 15th, because those are the kinds of things that are happening all over the world. And I mean, it's such a beautiful alignment with what's so necessary in the world.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'd like to thank you, Day, for being with us and for your beautiful work and for your inspiration. And I invite Harriet to take us out.
Well, yeah, just reiterating the thanks today. That was so beautiful to hear and very inspiring. And again, as you say, aligned. And it is really special to be sat in a cafe with people who really get this work, who do value the fallen leaves and cherish that relationship.
Yeah.
And that it's wonderful to know that the community is certainly growing. And so, yeah, let's go back there and realize that we've been sat in our cafe all along and our coffee's now gone cold or our cups are empty and it's time for us to leave. So we turn off the music, we turn off the lights, we go out of the door and we remember to shut it behind us and watch the fire in the grate just dying down. And remembering that we aren't alone in this, and that the earth, the practice that we are doing, that's been given to us through our connection to the earth, is there, and it's encouraging us to keep going. And that we're doing something very important for communities, but also for the earth. And so thank you again, Day, and everybody who's been watching. And yeah, please have a look at the YouTube channel if you want to see it, or the Facebook page.
And is
Or
there a
our
way
website.
for folks to find more about me?
What?
Will you be posting something?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. If folks want to find more about Morning Altars, it's morningaltars.com with an A. And the annual teacher training I do is morningaltars.com/teacher training. And you can also find out more about me on Instagram or Facebook at the same title, Morning Altars.
And I did want to mention that on March 27th for our Earth Exchange Cafe, we have Liv Torque. And Harry, you want to give a little introduction for her?
Yeah, wonderful. So next month, we're talking to Liv Torque, who is a poet, a spoken word artist, and she's currently working through the Hot Poets at the UN about climate connections and young people. And she wrote a fantastic and very powerful, poignant poem during just before lockdown called A Human Emergency. And it's been it's very inspiring, her work. So we'd love for you to come along to listen to that as well next month.
March 27th. See you all then. Thank you so much to all of you for listening. And Day, thank you for your work and for your presence.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation.